trend. Is that accurate?
It is, yes.
Okay. Were you able to review any of that survey?
No, I was not.
Okay. And you're still then able, though, to say that that 6.2% trend is reasonable?
Yes.
Okay. All right. On page 10 of Exhibit 14,
okay.
could you read the last two sentences under there's a little chart at the top of the page, the last two sentences in that paragraph, beginning with in aggregate.
In aggregate, total utilization shows a slight decrease from 2021 to 2022. These data suggest two plausible interpretations.
Okay, and then you go on to provide the two plausible explanations, which are what that medical utilization trend is 0 or slightly negative. That was one of them.
Yes.
And the other one was that the continued positive trend masked by random fluctuation or artificially inflated 2021 claims. That was. Could you state what that
yes,
second?
let me restate that, please.
Yeah.
So
yep.
There is an inherent challenge in studying. This really isn't limited to health insurance or anything. Studying this sort of data where there's an evolution over time. Because, of course, in reality, any number of things, effectively an infinite number of forces are impacting these things year over year. The task of forecasting, therefore, involves trying to decompose that historical change into long-term patterns and short-term patterns. There is never a perfect end to that process. There is always some ambiguity. COVID has exacerbated that dramatically because in effect, the very short term is arguably dominated by COVID, such that long-term trends are difficult to see. It has, I think, consistently been our position that one of the better ways to look at that is to look at the most recent data we have relative to pre-COVID numbers, to, as much as possible, not look at data that is heavily influenced by COVID. When you do that, the overall medical trend that would be implied is about 2% on average over the 3 years between 2019 and 2022, which is notably higher than what Blue Cross has assumed. There are certainly actuaries who are of the position that that number or something higher is what would be assumed here, or what should be assumed here. It is, of course, difficult to know with certainty that 2% is part of a long-term trend which extends both back to 2019 and forward to 2024. Nobody can know that with certainty. So it is possible, and I think reasonably likely that it is, part of a trend which was generally, increasing costs over the last several decades, right? There has consistently been a pattern of increasing costs. So it is possible, one very reasonable interpretation here is that what we're seeing coming out of COVID is that when you remove those aberrant years, that we're seeing a continuation of that trend upward. You could look at this data and say that 2022 was mostly after COVID, and therefore, well, you would have to go back really to 2021 and argue that 2021 is already sort of post-COVID, and then say that the gap from 2021 to 2022 shows a negative trend. That is a thing to consider, but I don't think that that is my default assumption about what's going on here. So what our report attempts to do is acknowledge the fact that there is no one way that you can look at this and definitively know what's going on, but that the two answers, the two kind of extreme answers you might give would suggest, you know, a +2 or a roughly 0.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was very long-winded, but I know this is a
yeah, and you're
complicated issue.
illustrating why you, on cross-examination, I should stick with yes/no questions. But so Blue Cross did not select a 2% positive trend. You say that they selected the positive 0.8 and that was reasonable in the aggregate. But to back up, you provided two plausible explanations. And one of those plausible explanations, right, was that medical utilization trend is 0 or slightly negative. That was a plausible assumption. And that's what you wrote. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to move on to pharmacy trend. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about pharmacy trend. So in your memo, that's at the bottom of page 11, you start talking about pharmacy trend. You say that for the most recent 3 years, utilization trend for non-specialty drugs shows increases of 4.4%, 2.1%, and 2.0% respectively. Is that what you said? That's at the bottom of the page?
Correct.
Could you read that next sentence crossing over onto page 12?
This fairly stable level of increase supports Blue Cross Blue Shield's assumption that it is a trend which will continue into the future, and Eleni agrees that an assumption of 2.0 for the next 2 years is reasonable.
Okay, and I'm just sort of clued in here on that language you used, fairly stable, but it is down really more than half over 3 years. It starts at 4.4, and at the end of 3 years, we're at 2. So that's a downward trend of more than half, is it not?
So you're talking about a second order trend. I don't like the phrase downward trend there. It's not accurate. Utilization is trending upward and has in each of these years. The trend in the trend, such that I believe this is a trend, and I'm not sure that I do, right? A trend in a trend. The trend is, you know, slightly lower in the third year than the second year, and notably lower in the second year than the first. But there is not a downward trend in utilization. There is an upward trend in utilization.
That makes sense. Thank you. I'm going to skip ahead to specialty pharmaceuticals, which it looks like, well, so there's this chart right here on page 11. And if I'm reading this right, specialty drugs make up 65% of Blue Cross's spend on pharmaceuticals. Is that right?
I believe that's approximately correct. Is that number on the page somewhere?
It's in this chart that's right in the middle of the page and the last row before the totals. Yep.
Yes,
yep.
Then yes.
Okay. And Blue Cross selected a 19.5% per year trend for specialty pharmaceuticals, right?
Correct.
And that is higher than the last 2 years of trend. Is that right for specialty pharmaceuticals?
I don't believe that's true, no. So if I look at the next page,
yep,
there's a table which reports the 2022 versus 2021 as being 23.0, which is higher than 19.5.
I think what I meant to say, it was higher than 2 of the 3 last years.
That is correct.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. That's what I meant to say. And it's also higher than the 3-year average.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay. And then you go on to say here on page 12 that Blue Cross arrives at this 19.5% by considering the average of 3 regression methods. So that's in the second paragraph below the little chart. Correct. And that 2 of those 3 regression methods consider 21 and 22 data. So is that correct?
Correct.
And that the third method considers all 3 years. Is that
Correct.
correct? And then, so you point out then that their 19.5% trend is based on 80% based on the highest year over year, the highest 80% based on the 1 year change from 2021 to 2022.
Correct.
And you take issue with that approach. You say, while LNE does not necessarily agree with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont's decision. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And if you could read that last sentence in that last full paragraph on the page, beginning with, so while other specialty trend assumptions.
So while other specialty trend assumptions would potentially be appropriate, LNE believes this is a reasonable assumption based on recent trends and particularly the volatility observed.
Okay, I'm just curious what some of the other reasonable assumptions might have been. Would the 3 year average of 14.9% have been reasonable?
I apologize for a potentially long answer here, but there's a nuance to answering that is unfortunate. So actuaries must consider not only whether each individual assumption is reasonable, but whether the assumptions considered in aggregate are reasonable. As I believe I alluded to before, I think the most natural thing to be doing here, given the volatility from COVID, is probably to be looking at effectively the 3 year average here. That is probably what I, as a pricing actuary, would have done in their shoes. And I would have done that across the board. So I probably would have calculated a higher medical trend number as well. So if I were to say it is reasonable to use the 3 year average specialty, it would be inappropriate for me to not say that consistently they probably should have used a higher number on medical.
Fair enough.
So in isolation, the answer to your question is yes, but within the context of the rest of the report, the answer is actually no.
Okay, thank you very much. If you could turn to the next page in your report, page 14. There's a section 7 that begins on that page, changes to other factors.
Yes.
Now, there's a whole slew of things that are lumped together into this change to other factors. It spreads across 2 pages, but the end result is that due to these other factors, rates in the individual market increase 5.3% and rates in the small group market go up 3.9%. Do I have that right?
I'm not looking at the 3.9, but the 5.3 is certainly accurate.
Okay. And I mean, if you could just flip over, it would be page 14 of your exhibit 15 as well, just to get both those numbers confirmed.
Yes.
3.9.
Yes.
Okay. And I'm not going to go through all of these other factors, but it looks like you said here in the second paragraph under non-systems claims, it looks like you said that the primary driver of this change is the reduction to pharmacy rebates. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Could you read the last sentence in that paragraph, beginning the impact of these drugs?
The impact of these drugs no longer producing pharmacy rebates was calculated by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont as increases of 1.5% and 1.2% for the individual and small group markets, respectively.
Okay. Did you ask Blue Cross to provide any support for this in any of your objections?
No.
Okay. So you were unable to independently verify or validate these calculations. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. How many other of these miscellaneous items adding up to 5.3% individual and 3.9% small group increases were you able to validate with information that Blue Cross provided?
That might take a second to answer. So there are several of the items within non-system claims that I believe the assumption is effectively they will be unchanged from the base period. And so certainly within our review, we do not audit whether claims about the base period experience are true. So I mean, I'm not able to independently verify, for example, how much money was paid by Blue Cross to a vendor. But to the extent that I can trust that those numbers are true, and I generally do, I believe I was able to independently review those numbers. The changes to ARPA is really, that's not actually contained within this filing. It's about the removal of something in last filing. We certainly independently reviewed that number. We reviewed the COVID adjustments both within this filing and last filing. We were provided data on the cyber attack impact. We were able to perform a limited review of the catastrophic claimants. I believe we have some numbers on the non-essential health benefit claims. And without reviewing the filing, I would have to go back and look at exactly what's contained in the changes in provider network. So I'm not entirely sure if I know the answer to that one.
Okay. I appreciate the response. I mean, I'm asking, I think, just because, it's labeled other factors, but it adds up to a significant amount of the increase, does it not?
It does.
Okay. All right. And so I appreciate that. It was nice to meet you, Mr. Ruggerberg. I have no additional questions.
Okay.
Thank you. Board Member Lunge, do you have questions?
Just a couple. Hi, Kevin. Hope you're well.
Hi. Thank you.
So as you testified earlier, it's your job as our actuary to review the information that you have available for reasonableness. Is that a fair statement?
Correct.
That doesn't mean that there aren't other reasonable assumptions that you would have determined were reasonable. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Board Member Holmes?
Yeah. Hi, Kevin.
Hi.
Just a quick one, and this relates to some of my earlier questions that you may have heard about COVID.
Yes.
So given the huge spike in the COVID rate at the start of 2022, both nationally and in Vermont, and its precipitous decline both nationally and in Vermont since then, as well as the market decline in hospitalization and ED visits since early 22, at least nationally, as tracked by the CDC. In your opinion, is it possible that using 2022 COVID experience to project or to assume that 2024 COVID claims will mirror 2022 claims, is that likely to overestimate the 2024 COVID costs, given what we know now about what's happened to COVID?
So my answer to that question is that the pattern with COVID really for most of the time has been peaks and troughs, and coming in waves, right? We have understood the history of COVID in terms of waves. I will, I guess, preface my response by saying that there is a good deal of disagreement about this between actuaries, but it is my concern that to view the entrance to or exit from those peaks as trends and projecting them forward doesn't necessarily capture the nature of what they actually look like. So to assume, for instance, as you described earlier, to take the first part of 2022 and ignore it because it was a peak and rely on the latter half of 2022, for example, would in effect assume that there will be no future waves, which is an assumption that I'm not sure I find reasonable. So to answer your question directly, you said, is it likely that it will over predict cost? And I think the answer is yes, when understood that way, but relative to the average expected cost, I think it is probably appropriate. And the average outcome is what should generally be reflected in insurance rates. So it is also likely that COVID costs are substantially higher than what they've assumed.
Are those peaks and troughs, were they all contained in a public health emergency?
I believe that is true.
Are we in that public health emergency any longer?
No, we're not.
If you took the average expected cost using 2022 alone and compared that to the average expected cost inclusive of 2023 treatment costs for COVID, do you think that average expected cost would be lower if you included 2023 data that we have to date?
For COVID costs, yes.
So wouldn't you want to use the most up-to-date, accurate information that you have to project 2024, which would be inclusive of the claims experience, which continues the decline from 2022 in your estimates for what's going to happen in 2024, because also we're out of a public health emergency?
Yes. But so my discomfort with that arises from things like flu cost, which have already been mentioned today. Flu was very low in 2022, and that might well be related to COVID. I have concern about adjusting the experience for only one aspect of COVID's effect, being the direct COVID costs and not potentially the other ramifications. So during the period when COVID was so high, there were other things that were abnormally low, like flu. So that's the source of my hesitation there. 2023 data is certainly more up to date. It is also limited in its accuracy due to the run out issues. So yeah, if the most up-to-date data was the most accurate data, it would certainly be the best to use. Unfortunately, that's rarely the case.
Okay, that's all my questions I have. Thanks.
Board Member Merman.
Hey, Kevin.
Hi.
I just have a couple questions for you on the term reasonable.
Okay.
We tend to all use specialty-specific, field-specific language, and there's different meanings outside the field. I use the word sick in my field and need to be very careful that I don't use sick at home, because when I'm talking with my intensive care colleagues and use the word sick, I'm meaning gravely ill. And when I'm at home and my kid has a sniffle, I use the word sick. Could you define how you use the word reasonable?
I will attempt to do so succinctly.
I should have put that caveat in there.
Yeah. So actuaries are inherently dealing with uncertainties. That's the nature of our work. And each actuary will generally have a different interpretation of the available data. And so there is uncertainty that each actuary will acknowledge, in addition to uncertainty between actuary, variation in expectations between actuaries. When reviewing a filing, reasonable is generally going to mean consistent with the available data, with some consideration to whether it is likely given the available data. So generally, when we're referring to something as reasonable, we are saying that we think it is near the most likely value, given our understanding of the data.
So different than how reasonable might be used kind of colloquially, which would I think more of sort of thought of as extreme or excessive, using it more in the term of sort of logically valid.
Correct. That is a very good distinction to draw. I'm using it in the sense that it is reasonable given the circumstances of this filing. It is not a statement about whether the circumstances of this filing are reasonable in a more colloquial sense.
So when you would say that the rates are reasonable, they're reasonable based off of the inputs into the rates.
Correct.
And when you review the inputs into the rates, say like the medical cost trend, you're looking at, are you, my impression is you're looking at the available data, say, from the hospital budget submissions.
Correct.
But are you evaluating whether or not the hospital budget submissions are reasonable?
I am not.
Okay. That's all I have to ask. Thanks.
Chair Foster.
I don't have any questions, but thank you for your work on behalf of the board.
It's my pleasure.
Ms. Belleville, any redirect?
May I have one moment to check?
Sure. Yeah.
Thanks. I believe we have no further questions.
Thank you. Mr. D'Onofrio, there was quite a bit of ground covered there between the start and the finish. Do you have any additional questions for Mr. Ruggelberg before I let him go?
I don't, thank you.
Okay. So, given the time, my preference would be to try to push through Ruth Green's direct testimony and then break for lunch. Does that sound feasible to do before we have some constraints with the, well, before like 1:30? Get through that before 1:30?
I'm sorry, Hearing Officer Barber, are you asking if we would get through Ms. Green's direct testimony before 1:30?
Yeah, I figure we should get through her direct testimony, take a lunch break, and come back and do the cross.
Yes, we can finish the direct before lunch. Blue Cross will need a short break because we need to change the rooms to be in the witness room.
Okay.
5 minutes at the most, if we could have that, Hearing Officer.
Yeah, why don't we come back at 11:35 and take Ruth Green's testimony then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Off the record.
Right, I think everyone is back. It's a lot easier to keep track of 4 board members than 5 on my screen. So why don't we go back on record
On the record?
and we'll take the testimony of Ruth Green. Ms. Green, could you please raise your right hand and I'll swear you in? Do you solemnly swear that the evidence you shall give relative to the cause now under consideration shall be the truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Ms. Acey?
Thank you, Hearing Officer Barber. Would you please again state your full name for the record?
My name's Ruth Green.
Ms. Green, what is your position with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont?
I hold the position of treasurer and CFO.
Did you prepare and submit pre-filed testimony in this proceeding?
I did. It's incorporated as Exhibit 19.
Is the testimony contained in Exhibit 19 true and correct to the best of your knowledge?
Yes, it is.
Ms. Green, did you direct Blue Cross's actuarial director to include a contribution to reserves, or CTR, in the 2024 filed rates in these markets?
Yes, I did.
What CTR did you direct?
3%?
Have you explained the basis for a 3% CTR in your pre-filed testimony?
Yes, I explained the basis of a 3% CTR in my pre-filed testimony and also in Attachment C to the filing, which is incorporated also in my pre-filed testimony.
Would you please briefly sum up the main reasons for requesting a 3% CTR in these markets this year?
Sure. There's 4 main reasons I'd like to summarize. One is the Blue Cross's member reserves are below the level required to support an RBC that is in the range ordered by the Department of Financial Regulation. Secondly, the reason for a 3% CTR is that Blue Cross has a number of financial headwinds that we continue to navigate. The main one being we're in an environment of increasing pharmacy and medical trends, and fast increases in those areas, which is, as we've determined earlier in this hearing, is the majority of the premium rates. We also, other financial headwinds include uncertainties in both the markets and the economy in general, and an overall inflationary environment, which we have to navigate like others in the Vermont business community. Another reason for the third reason for a 3% CTR is that we have had weathered recent losses, operating losses and market losses in 2022 that have reduced member reserves to a level that brings our most recent RBC reported to a new low. And most importantly, lastly, and most relevant here, is that the ACA individual and small group segment has not realized CTR to the minimum level of 1.5% in recent years, and we need to increase the likelihood that the premiums that we charge are fully funding the maintenance of reserves.
Ms. Green, have you explained what member reserves are and why they are important?
Yes, I explained the importance of member reserves in my pre-filed testimony, also in Attachment C that's included therein. But just to summarize real briefly, the importance of reserves is that Blue Cross is obligated to pay our members' claims no matter what, and we do have to estimate well in advance, as we've been talking about in this hearing, what those claims might be. And so we do need to have those reserves to cover the unforeseen circumstances and protect our members in the case of having to pay claims no matter what. We also have an important purpose of reserves is to provide a solid financial foundation to invest in things like membership growth. Membership growth requires additional reserves. We also, our mission and our role in Vermont as a single state Blue Plan focused just on Vermont. We want to serve more and more Vermonters, which requires entering new markets. And then we also require solid foundation of reserves to invest in capabilities that will continue to allow us to improve access to care, quality of care, and also invest in capabilities that our customers require. And many of those capabilities will also help us lower the cost of care over the long haul. So reserves play a foundational role in all of that.
You mentioned supporting membership growth. Could you explain, please, why growing membership draws on reserves?
Sure. Membership growth draws on reserves because every member that joins our rolls, when we enroll a new member, we're making a commitment to pay their claims no matter what. And as Martine testified earlier today, sometimes members don't incur the claims that the average premium covers, and many times members incur significant claims over that average. So every time a member comes into our enrollment and we grow membership, our reserves are taking on that additional risk. And so in the near term, immediately when that member joins Blue Cross, we have the risk, but we only have the contribution to reserve to accumulate over time as that member stays with us, that will ultimately maintain the reserves in a place that allows us to take that risk. So membership growth is a very important point because in order for us to grow and serve more Vermonters, we need to have adequate member reserves.
You've used the term RBC a couple of times this morning. And what does RBC refer to?
RBC
Miss Ashley,
is,
I'm so sorry. Could you speak up a little bit? I'm having a bit of a hard time hearing you.
Sure.
Absolutely, thank you. You've used the term RBC a couple of times in your testimony. What does that refer to?
RBC is a ratio. It's a ratio that compares the amount of risk that Blue Cross has taken on in its insured business and compares it to the amount of reserves that we have to cover in the case of unforeseen events. So we take the reserves and divide it by the risk, and that's the ratio.
So just to go back to the membership growth point, when new members, when Blue Cross takes on more membership or its membership grows, how does that impact the RBC calculation?
So mechanically, the way it works is additional members will require the denominator to grow, and the denominator will, in order to keep the same ratio, you'd have to have the numerator grow as well. So by virtue of the growth in the membership has to be sustained by additions to the member reserve.
What is Blue Cross's current risk-based capital or RBC level?
Our current risk-based capital at the end of 2022, December 31st, 2022, was 434.
How does that compare to the RBC range required by the Department of Financial Regulation?
That 434 is well below the bottom end of the range ordered by the Department of Financial Regulation, which is 590 to 745.
Is the Department of Financial Regulation monitoring Blue Cross's RBC level?
Yes, the Department of Financial Regulation monitors our RBC level, and we provide periodic reports. In addition to the annual report, we periodically update DFR on the forward-looking projections for our risk-based capital and solvency.
Ms. Green, have you read DFR's solvency letter in this proceeding?
I have.
Do you have any reaction to the DFR letter to share with the board today?
Yes, the DFR letter for the individual market is included in Exhibit 16, and I think the small group is Exhibit 17. I do want to draw the board's attention to a couple of statements that DFR consistently makes that provide for the foundation of the insurer's solvency. 2 points really. One is any reduction in rates that aren't actuarially supported will undermine Blue Cross's solvency. The other point I wanted to draw out is that DFR has consistently made the point that insurer solvency is the most fundamental aspect of maintaining consumer protection. And embedded in that thought, they go on to say that the way an insurer stays solvent is that it has to consistently charge premiums that are fully funded. So the basis of solvency is really grounded in charging fully funded rates consistently.
Ms. Green, are you prepared to provide additional testimony and answer questions regarding Blue Cross's RBC projections for 2023 and 2024?
I am.
Is it appropriate to provide that testimony in public session?
It is not.
Why not?
Our forward-looking financial projections are confidential, commercially sensitive information that provides us competitive advantage. We make reasonable efforts to keep our forward-looking projections confidential, and this is important in a competitive market. And many of our assumptions in those forward-looking projections include confidential contract negotiations as well.
So hearing Officer Barber, understanding that an executive session is contemplated for later in the hearing, Blue Cross would reserve additional direct questions on that topic until that period. We'll move on from that topic now. Ms. Green, have you read Lewis and Ellis's actuarial opinion?
I have.
Did you have any reaction to that opinion to share with the board?
I had two things that I'd like to draw out, but I'll be real brief because they've been touched on previously in today's testimony. The first was I appreciated the analysis and research that Eleni did to compare administrative costs to other health plans nationally. They concluded that we are atypically a low administrative cost plan given our small plan size, and they went on to say that it appears that we manage and limit our expenses better than the typical health plan. This is something that I've known for years. I've testified a number of years about how Blue Cross is continually focused on delivering service and quality products, and our very robust provider network for the lowest cost possible. And we allocate our precious resources, whether that's our expert people resources or our technology and programs, to where we feel there's most value. And this is something that we do actively, and it really allows us to both be efficient and also participate in the health care system broadly in Vermont, our local focus. For instance, we participate meaningfully in health care reform efforts, even with the low administrative costs. The second item I wanted to just draw out was L&E's support for the 3% CTR. They looked at that and based on the RBC level and a comparison that they did to other plans nationally, they found that our CTR of 3% was at the 52nd percentile, which is right in the middle of the pack, and was reasonable. I'd also like to just point out that even last year when L&E's report was issued, and through my testimony, it was clear that there was a growing sense that the CTR would need to be increased, and for two reasons. One is we've always said that if the RBC, this is our philosophy for determining the CTR to include in our rates, is that if the RBC falls below the bottom end of the range ordered by DFR and is not immediately expected to move back into that range, it would require an increase in the CTR. And the second important point is that we knew with the increase in hospital budgets and medical cost trend rising quickly, that the minimum necessary CTR to maintain reserves would have to go up. The 1.5% was really the appropriate only in the environment where the minimum necessary had medical trends in, say, the mid-single digits, and we're now into the low and high teens. So the CTR required to minimally maintain reserves has to also go up, and that's what's driven us to the 3% assumption.
There were questions earlier in the hearing today about COVID costs and assumptions about COVID costs in the proposed rates. Was there anything you wanted to add on that subject?
Yes, I thought I could potentially help with the understanding about how the COVID cost assumptions are impacting rates by just elaborating that the reason that Blue Cross had been estimating the COVID costs and tracking COVID costs is that we pulled them out of our premiums in 2021, 2, and 3 because we had, as everyone remembers, what sometimes is referred to as a claims lull in 2020. So it was important for us, we said that's what reserves are for. The lull in 2020 would be offset by COVID claims as they come through in 21, 22, and 23. And I just wanted to point out that the reason that we're not pulling that out anymore is that we've depleted reserves. In other words, we've spent more on COVID costs than we benefited from the lull in 2020. So we're now including those costs in premiums. And so the calculation of how much that's affecting rates is really just a calculation of how much we would have taken out had we continued down that path. So I just wanted to share that context for the folks that are trying to figure out what a reasonable assumption about that would be. So the experience and the amounts are all in the rates for 2024, and the debate about what the assumption is really just a debate about how much of the increase is due to that. It's, as Martine testified earlier, the COVID costs are really just being trended alongside of all of the other similar costs in our claims experience. I don't know if that helped, but I just thought I'd offer that up.
Corinne, have you testified in your pre-filed testimony that Blue Cross's requested rates satisfy the applicable regulatory criteria?
I have.
I've heard a number of questions today directed at the topic of affordability. Would you please explain why Blue Cross's rates satisfy the affordability criteria?
Yes, I can, and I'll again be hopefully quite brief because the points I had planned to cover have been covered already in some way this morning. First, as the board has recognized, affordability is but one criteria among several criteria that have to be carefully balanced. And you know, the non-actuarial criteria of affordability, quality, and access, you know, there's some tension between those criteria, as the board has recognized in the past. So anytime there's a attempt to reduce a premium rate purely to make the premium cheaper in the name of affordability, while in doing so, it doesn't cover the costs of health care and paying claims, what that ultimately does is undermine and will imperil Vermonters' access to care, because it undermines the solvency of the insurance company. And that's what DFR meant when they said that you know, protecting solvency is the ultimate form of consumer protection. So affordability ultimately has to acknowledge that the premiums have to cover the cost of insurance and the cost of paying claims. So that there's a difference between determining whether a premium rate is adequate and as compared to looking at the affordability of the program. The second point I thought I'd make is the you know, the board's asking, what does Blue Cross think about when it thinks about affordability? The premium rate being fully funded to maintain reserves is kind of the table set. It has to be that way, otherwise it undermines the solvency. And we have supported through the documentation and the testimony so far that there isn't any padding in the rates. So really the need to cover the rates for the minimum of the medical and pharmacy costs plus the cost of insurance is, you know, that in our view is a given. However, as I think Martine and Chair Foster talked about, that affordability has to take into account what it is that you're paying for. And in Vermont, when we have strong access to care and high quality coverages that are required in this regulatory framework, the affordability is you know, is the other piece that has to give and reflect that we have very high quality coverage here in Vermont. So the health insurance premiums are very, very high, but they cover healthcare services that are also expensive and increasingly more expensive. And then lastly, I just wanted to point out or share that there was a conversation about the subsidies and would things be affordable without the subsidies. It's important for us all to remember that the ACA regulatory framework is really designed, the whole program was designed to bring more coverage to more Americans and more Vermonters, and to ensure that we don't have increasing uninsured rate. So from the individual consumer's perspective, we really do have to incorporate, and we do think about the subsidies as part of the overall framework. And if we were designing a system that everyone had to pay direct, we collectively, not Blue Cross, but the program of the ACA in Vermont might have to make different choices about access and quality coverage if that were the case. So I just thought I'd share some thoughts about how we see the affordability from the perspective of adequate premium rate.
I think, Trina, you also heard questions from board member Ms. Chair Foster about how Blue Cross considers its members' financial circumstances and access to care.
I'm
Are you
gonna-
able to further
Sorry,
address?
sorry, Bridget. We're gonna ask you to restate the question. I think you were muffled there for a little bit.
Sure, sorry, I'll bring the phone a little closer here. I think, Ms. Green, that you heard earlier in the hearing questions from board members and Chair Foster about how Blue Cross considers its members' financial circumstances and access to care. Are you able to further address how Blue Cross considers those factors as part of its mission?
Yes, thanks. I would like to address some of those questions. Martine Lemieux is our lead actuary and is responsible for calculating what we think the premiums need to be in 2024 to cover the cost of insurance and claims. And so that is a very specific exercise to determine what we think the fully funded premiums would look like in 2024. But when asked about how does Blue Cross think about affordability as we're doing that, we really are sort of deeply invested in our mission as a fully functioning member of the health care system here in Vermont. And a lot of what we are doing are looking for opportunities to help our members, sign up for the policies that they can afford and get the subsidies that they should be making sure that they're looking for, that they get. We have, as a nonprofit health insurer, we're always working to make sure that the members get the care that they need for the coverage that they're paying for. Our service is very much focused on, we call it taking the member out of the middle when they're just trying to navigate getting the services that they need. We also have, on a day-to-day basis, we're totally familiar and aware, keenly aware of how hard it is for some of our customers to make ends meet. In the COVID response, we were very flexible about how payments could be made, and on a day-to-day basis, even today, even before the flood circumstances of last week, we are very member-focused, and we'll talk through with people if they're finding it difficult to make a payment and need some more time, or maybe a payment program. So I think when asked about how are we thinking about affordability as we develop the rates, we're always thinking about the healthcare costs in the Vermont system, and when we develop the rates, we are clearly focused on making sure that they are adequately funded so that the solvency can provide that ultimate consumer protection that is a key part of our role.
Thank you. That concludes Ms. Green's direct testimony for the public session.
Thank you. Then I think this is a good time to take a lunch break, come back and do cross any redirect, and then move on to Jesse Lucier would be the next witness. So unless there are any objections, I propose we come back at 12:35 for that.
That sounds good to me.
Great, so we'll adjourn until 12:35. Thank you.
Thank you.
Off the record. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Can hear you.
Thank you.
I think we're just waiting on. Oh, here we go. Seemed to go by quicker than Monday's half-an-hour break. So I think everyone is back. So let's go back on record.
On the record.
And Ms. Green, I just want to remind you that you're still under oath, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Becker for questions.
Thank you, Hearing Officer Barber. Nice to meet you, Ms. Green. Been reading your memos for the past year, but it's good to see you face to face. Well, almost face to face. So if I could just have you turn to Exhibit 4, which is your memorandum to Martine Lemieux.
I'm there.
Okay. So in that second paragraph down under overall CTR philosophy, you say Blue Cross Vermont has long held that a long-term CTR of 1.5% represents an adequate yet not excessive contribution to member reserves. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then that very last sentence on the page, you say, while Blue Cross VT believes that CTR should be managed to an adequate long-term level rather than fluctuating significantly from year to year with changes in membership and healthcare cost trends, we do need to reflect the inherent risk within each market segment and current economic and healthcare environments. Is that accurate?
I'm just not, where are you on the page for that one?
Oh, it's the very last, it's the last paragraph that starts on the page but does not complete on the page, while Blue Cross Vermont believes. Yep.
Yep, I'm with you.
Okay. And so the part there I want to highlight is that CTR should be managed to an adequate long-term level. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay. And so I guess what I'm wondering then is, with this memo, are you saying that the recommended CTR in the ACA markets will be at 3% for the long term?
I'm saying in the memo that it's 3% until the conditions to change it tell us that we should change it. So right now, the RBC being well below the bottom end of the range ordered by DFR, and the higher medical trends dictate a higher long-term assumption. And if those conditions change, as we've also said in the memo, as I've also said in the memo, you know, we would change that long-term assumption occasionally. The reason we call it a long-term assumption is that if we calculated the amount of CTR required in any given year to sustain member reserves to a level that's within the ordered range, it would fluctuate wildly. It would be very, very, very high some years and lower other years. So we try and manage to a long-term assumption, but recognize that that assumption has to take into account the conditions in which we're navigating.
Okay, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, you're not recanting that. I mean, you think that CTR should be managed on a long-term basis. It shouldn't be fluctuating wildly. Is that accurate?
Right, on a year-to-year basis.
Okay. So what I want to, what I'm getting at here is, right, when I think about something like the Federal Reserve raising interest, right, they do things gradually, and this is the double, 1.5 to 3. Wouldn't a more modest adjustment be appropriate if you're thinking about managing it over the long term?
We could make a more modest adjustment, but given where our RBC is and where it is relative to the ordered range, 3% seemed like an appropriate adjustment to increase the likelihood that our premiums would be fully maintaining reserves. And as I indicated, we shared last year that with the higher medical trend, the minimum necessary to keep pace with a medical trend that is admittedly rising very quickly, a more modest increase would not be recommended at this point, in my view.
Okay, thank you. So I don't know if you were listening to the testimony earlier, but I asked Ms. Lemieux what a 3% CTR comes out to on a PM basis, and then overall dollars. So we got the PM figures, but we didn't get the overall dollars. Do you happen to know what it
and I made a note that you were estimating that at 13 million, and you're correct, it's 13 million.
Okay, thank you very much.
In 2024.
Yeah, perfect. So I guess what I would want to know then is, if Blue Cross Vermont lost $13 million in 1 year on a particular book of business, how would you describe those losses? Significant?
Yes, I would, and the losses that we experienced in 2022 were significant and on the order of magnitude similar.
Okay, so among the reasons, I'm back on your memo, among the reasons that you cite for the 3% CTR recommendation is the importance of adequately funded premiums. That's the first heading on page 2, and you go on to describe what you mean by that. I mean, that's a pretty uncontroversial notion. Would you agree? Adequately funded premiums?
I would hope so, and it's very consistent with what I testified about the importance of DFR's opinions, that adequately funded premiums is fundamental to protecting solvency. Okay.
So I'm going to ask you to jump over to Exhibit 22 and page 3 of Exhibit 22. And just if we could, so this is Exhibit 22 is Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont's 2022 annual statement.
That's correct.
Okay. And so on page 53, note 18, there's a note here about losses from ASO uninsured plans. Could you state what Blue Cross Vermont's total losses on ASO plans were in 2022?
It is a loss of 14,410,000.
Okay. Do you have a rough sense of how many RBC points equal $14.4 million?
That would be about 50 percentage points of RBC, give or take.
Okay. Is there any, I mean, you don't have premiums with ASO plans. Is there a CTR that you ask of these customers?
Yes, there's the ASO plans, when we look at Blue Cross's overall books of business across the enterprise, we operate in a number of different competitive environments, and so when the administrative services only book of business is required to contribute a contribution to reserve that reflects the risk that that business brings to the RBC calculation, and you know, that is very similar to the 3% CTR on the insured books of business, but it's calculated differently because the underlying risks are different.
Could I ask you a little bit more about that? Calculated based on their risk. I mean, there is no risk with these plans, or is there any risk with these ASO plans?
Yes, there's risk. The way our administrative services only, sometimes it's called ASC, which is Administrative Services Contracts, which is you know, mainly credit risk, where we'll be funding the claims incurred by a self-funded client ahead of, we'll be paying the providers for those claims before collecting from the client. So there's a credit risk. There's also some risk related to whether or not there's stop-loss coverage. In some cases, there's stop-loss coverage, and that stop-loss coverage would require, in fact, stop-loss has a quite high contribution to reserve requirement because of the risk involved.
Okay.
As examples.
So you say it's in line with the risk that you take on for these ASO customers, and so that it's sort of equivalent to the 3% that you're asking of the insured books of business. I mean, is it anywhere, do you know, anywhere close to the 13 million? At this 3% CTR?
When if I use the word equivalent, I didn't mean to use the word equivalent. It's each segment is funding the maintenance of reserves for the risk that it brings to the RBC ratio. So in that sense, it's equivalent, but the amount would be very different. In fact, I can just confirm that the ACA, individual and small group business, both because its membership is quite high and because the risk is quite high, is by far the largest contributor or detractor from member reserves because of the nature of that risk. Fully insured, and it's a very, as we said earlier, it's a very expensive coverage.
Okay, thank you. Could I have you turn to Exhibit 13?
Yep.
So these are Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont's responses to HCA questions, and specifically, could you turn to page 4?
I'm there.
Okay, so question 6, this is a very complicated question that I did not write. My colleague, Mr. Schulteis, wrote this question. And this answer is also very complicated. You'd probably need an advanced degree to parse out everything it says. But I want to ask you about one detail. The answer describes something called a PDR liability, and I don't want to get too in the weeds on what that is, but there's a sentence here at the top of page 5. A PDR is a liability that is established when the estimated costs related to insured or ASO contracts exceeds the revenue expected to be earned during the remainder of the contract period. Did I read that correctly?
Yep.
Okay. And then the response goes on to say at the start of that next paragraph that the vast majority of the PDR liability reported at both year-end 2021 and 2022 relates to ASO contracts. Did I also read that correctly?
Yes.
And so we've already sort of established that the level of risk that you're taking on with these customers is significantly lower than the risk you're taking on with your insured books of business.
It's lower in the sense that for each contract period, they're charged for, the risk that that contract brings. Yes.
I'm just trying to get a sense of, 14 million. We've already, you said that 13 million was a lot to lose. And so 14 million would also be a lot to lose. The answer here, it refers to, inadequate revenue sources on jumbo ASO contracts beyond base admin fees to cover projected costs as one reason for the loss. Another being multi-year rate guarantees necessary to retain these key customers. And then you conclude here with, this book of business is currently in a loss position that management is taking steps to resolve over time. That's at the end of the second to last paragraph.
Yep.
Okay. So my question is, these ASO customers, it sounds like you feel you need to give them multi-year rate guarantees to retain them. They have some clout to negotiate with you, such that management is willing to take time to resolve the losses in this market, right?
Yeah, is there a question in there? Sorry,
Yeah, I mean, I just, I'm getting back to the end, but the individual and small group markets, some of the most vulnerable Vermonters, they have to pay 3% of their claims for CTR.
Right.
Okay. That's all I had to ask. Thank you very much, Ms. Green.
Okay.
Okay, we'll move to board questions, starting with Board Member Lunge.
Thank you. I also have a couple questions about RBC. So could you quantify either the I'm going to use profit in quote, I think you understand what I mean, or loss from your Medicare Advantage business?
Sure. And quantify, depending on what metric you're interested in, we can certainly follow up with some further details. But the, excuse me, the Medicare Advantage business has relatively recently been launched. It's in its third year of enrollment, and so it's currently losing, and the business case to get into the Medicare Advantage market segment and serve those Vermonters was that it would lose money in the first 4 years, and then it would break even, and as it gains scale, it would generate, and the plan is, and the target is, that it would generate a similar 3% CTR on that insured risk. We had startup losses in the year that we launched, and then we've had operating losses in the last 2 years as that business grows and gains scale. Again, Blue Cross is serving multiple markets, so the technology and processes and business operations that's required to serve the Medicare Advantage market adds cost to the business, and it isn't until that book of business achieves a certain scale that it would, excuse me, begin to contribute to reserves in the way that we would expect it to on a regular basis. And I would link that back to my comments earlier about the need to have member reserves and RBC in a place where, as we're entering new markets and growing membership, that we're able to support that kind of business growth.
Sure. And so do you know what your most recent losses were from 2022?
I can dig that specific number out for you, as you may.
Happy to have you follow up. Yeah, happy to have
Yeah.
you follow up.
Yeah.
Okay.
As you may recall, one of the designs of our Medicare Advantage launch included a risk share with a partner, so
Yes.
that we only experience half of whatever their gains and losses are. But we'll provide that information to you from the 2022 period.
Thank you. So now just 1 second. I wanted to talk a little bit about, let me find the right place here. Okay, it's Exhibit 12. And attached to the responses to the questions in Exhibit 12, there is an Exhibit 1, which is on page 15.
Right, yep, I'm there.
Okay, great. So this exhibit details the assumptions that were used to create the RBC model and have an understanding of what your range would be for 2023 and 2024. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so in this exhibit, you've outlined membership assumptions, right?
Right.
And claims assumptions.
Correct.
And then there are some additional assumptions related to administrative expenses, investment returns, and pension. Is that right?
Correct.
Are there
I'm sorry, I
other?
didn't catch that.
Yes.
Did you
correct.
not? Oh, sorry. Cassidy, did you get what you needed?
Just the answer again. Thank you.
So Ruth, if you could just repeat your answer, I think that's what Cassidy missed.
Yeah, that's correct. That includes the assumption, other categories such as administrative expenses, investment returns, and pension. Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I'm flipping among exhibits, so I just need 1 minute to find the other information I was looking for. And so in Exhibit 13, there are, in addition to some of the information that Mr. Becker spoke with you about, there is also some information related to the pension liabilities on page 2 to 3. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and could we in past years, we've spent quite a bit of time on the pension liability. And so I just wanted to get your sort of general statement about how the pension liability is currently influencing the RBC level.
Sure. As outlined in the answers in Exhibit 13, the pension liability, the way the pension accounting works, it's valued at every year end, and the accounting gain or loss, funded or underfunded, whichever nomenclature you prefer, is recorded in our balance sheet. And so in 2022, as we outlined, I think in question, the answer to question 3, it shows up in the change in surplus in the annual statement based on the the balance sheet valuation of the pension. And that happens every year, and we had an increase in surplus in 2022 as a result of the pension valuation improving, mainly due to the recoveries from the Allianz litigation settlement.
Thanks. And in, hold on just one more minute. Let me find it. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to Exhibit 19, which is your pre-filed testimony. And let's go to page 6 and let me know when you're there.
Exhibit page 6. Yeah.
Exhibit 19, page 6.
Okay, I'm there.
Okay, so in the footnote on that page, and I'm using the page in red, not the page, so it's page 5 of 11 or page 6 in the red numbering, just to make sure we're in the same place.
Yeah.
In your footnote, I highlighted several items that influenced RBC levels. In prior years, you'd been able to produce for us sort of a quantification of the different factors that were moving RBC up and down, just so that we could have a let's say a simpler understanding of the impacts from those items. I did not see that in the materials this year. Is that something that you'd be able to provide?
So we can provide something that shows what the changes in RBC were from the end of 2021 to the end of 2022, and off the top of my head, I don't recall if that was in previous years' materials. The changes in the RBC going forward is the piece that we've transitioned over to the statistical modeling exercise, and it's less relevant to show the changes. But if it would be helpful, I can certainly provide something that shows you the changes that led to the 434 at the end of 2022.
That would be helpful to me to understand how we kind of got to where we are today. Okay, I also had a couple of questions related to the affiliation with the Blue Cross Plan of Michigan, and I certainly understand that some of these questions may require confidential answers, but I'm going to go ahead and ask in case it is public information, and then if not, please just indicate and we can take that up in executive session.
Sure.
Okay. So in your testimony related to the affiliation, it sounds like one of the major benefits of the affiliation is access to improved technology. Is that an accurate characterization?
That's true.
And what types of technology would that potentially include?
Yeah, it actually includes all types of technology, ranging from just more cost-effective sourcing of the basics, whether that's infrastructure, network, and cybersecurity protections, things like that. That would be one end of the spectrum. We have to do a lot of the same things that larger health plans have to do, and we tend to have to pay the same cost, but we're such a small health insurance plan that those fixed costs become very, very, on a relative basis, much more costly for us than a large plan. So the basics is a big piece of it. We also would expect to have an opportunity to not have to build some of the new things. I'll just pick an example. We, for years, have been wanting to invest more in our ability to manage and control and use our data and analytics, and that's a very expensive technological proposition and requires oftentimes even expertise that we would have to go out and acquire in the market. So there's some, I'll call it, not so cutting edge technologies that we're just behind being able to sort of meet the minimum threshold on. And so the expectation would be to be able to partner with Michigan to utilize their capabilities instead of having to build them from scratch ourselves. So that's another piece of it. And then I guess the third bucket I would put in the technology category would be just as new things are being rolled out and tried on, that's also a very expensive proposition because of the risk of things not working out, and a lot of times it's easier for us to look and see what works and then adapt it or adopt it in our business rather than trying it out. So that sort of other end of the spectrum of trying on new things should be more affordable for us. We've avoided doing some of that in the past because we just can't afford to charge our marketplace for that. Another good example on the middle bucket is a real familiar example, and that would be a mobile app. For several years now, we've wanted to have a mobile app that would help our members as they're navigating the healthcare system, and that is a very expensive thing to do and do right, and that's a good example of something that we don't have to build from scratch. We can lean on the Michigan organization who's got a mobile app. It's a well rated mobile app, and they've been doing it for many years, so it would be something that we could adopt relatively cost effectively.
Thank you. So would you anticipate, for example, using their claims processing software?
Well, the good news is the claims processing software that they use is the same software that we use. So that is a nice side benefit of partnering with Michigan. They use NASCO. We implemented NASCO a few years ago. So we're excited to be able to take what they've been able to do with the claims system. They've been able to invest in some enhancements and coding around the core systems that we, as just a quote average customer of NASCO, we didn't have the add-ons that they would have built themselves. So that is another opportunity for us.
Thank you. So would you overall, and I understand certainly that you're not anticipating that the timings for the affiliation plus implementation of new IT would hit in 2024. Is that a fair characterization from your pre-filed testimony?
Yes, I hope I said it relatively directly in the pre-filed testimony that switching over to some of these new things will take some time, and there's a planning process that has to happen to get the order correct.
Okay. And do you have an order of magnitude for the timeline? Like, for example, would you anticipate rolling out different components of the IT upgrades, I'll call them, over 2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, I guess I could characterize that the time frames that both parties are thinking about when we think about realizing value is sort of a 3-year horizon. It certainly will extend well beyond 3 years, but we recognize that there's value in making sure that we enter into the partnership and harvest the value as quickly as we can, and so we're thinking about that in sort of a 3-year time frame. So broadly speaking, the first year is planning and setting up the changeover, and then in years 2 and 3 there would be some changes that would allow us access to some of these capabilities in a new way.
Okay. I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Sure.
Board Member Holmes?
Yeah, thank you. Lots of questions answered as well already for me. I wonder, I just want to make a question around, or maybe it's a clarifying and perhaps adding to what Member Lunge had asked about the RBC follow-up. Will you be able to decompose for us the declines in our RBC, maybe over the last, more than just the last year, maybe the last 3 years, into the relative contributions to RBC of what I'm thinking about these component parts? By this, I mean investment gains and losses as one component, Medicare Advantage as a component, large group, small group, individual, ASO, just to try and understand what are the, the drivers overall and their relative impacts. Is that what you're planning to provide in follow-up, or is it slightly different?
Yeah, so in response to Board Member Lunge's question, I was thinking of a one-year view, but what I'm hearing, Jessica, from your perspective, it would be helpful to understand a multiple year view. I just mentioned earlier that the Medicare Advantage investment has been over a number of years. Our growth, when you look at, we had a period of membership decline, which would have buoyed RBC, and now in a period where we have growth, that takes a while to digest, so that a multi-year view could be useful there. The investment gains and losses is a really good example. I can speak to that. That was a big source of loss in 2022, and I'll try and be brief, but with member reserves, of course, we invest those reserves in assets, and we broadly allocate among asset classes to both protect the reserves, but also have a return. And so historically, we've had an allocation of 20% of the portfolio to equities as a way to grow surplus. 2022 was the worst year in equities since 2008, and we lost, like a lot of folks did, a lot on the equity market. But if you look at what equities have contributed to our member reserves for the whole time that we've been invested in equities, it's still a net positive. I dug the numbers out. I think we lost $18 million last year, but net positive for the whole time of being invested in equities. Even with that loss, we're still a plus close to $9 million. So the long-term strategy for investing in equities is to help grow surplus. But at the same time, in any given year, you're going to have a downturn. So I can certainly produce that information. That information is right in the annual statement each year, and I've pulled an exhibit that just pulls the last 6 or 8 years worth of that picture that I can certainly pull together and share, if that would be helpful.
No, that would be great. It's just helpful to understand what are the component parts and what's driving it. It's clear that it's been declining, but to understand, we only see part of the business, here, and just try and understand your idea of how it breaks down year over year and the contributing factors. I think would just be helpful. Yeah. Let me just see. I think one of the questions I had was actually on Exhibit 1, page 9, in the second to last paragraph. It says, Blue Cross Vermont has invested in Civic RX, a nonprofit enterprise that will bring to market lower cost options for prescription drugs. While its impact on pharmacy spend is not expected to be significant in 2024, and it goes on to say, so I guess my question was, how much was it a direct investment? Did you mean that literally, or did you mean figuratively invest in? And if it's literally, I'm wondering what the investment dollar amount was, and then when you think it will actually, return on that investment in terms of having significant savings on pharmacy spend.
Yes, this is a really good example of one of the things that having a solid foundation of member reserves allows us to invest in things like this that does require, and it was a literal investment, and I've added just now to my list of things to dig out for you. It was in the comparison of the things we've been talking about, it was relatively small compared to, say, Medicare Advantage or some of the other things we've been talking about. So, but I'll dig that out, and the returns on that were very far out because it actually involves setting up facilities to produce generic equivalents for drugs that don't have competition. So it had a very long development tail, but it was an investment that was made jointly with a number of Blue plans, so that the Vermont investment was quite modest.
Do you recall, or maybe when you follow up, just when that long tail was supposed to turn positive, or when you're expecting those returns? And I recognize, yeah, it's going to take some time to build those facilities and get that production going. But I just would be curious as to when the expectation was that at the time of the investment anyway, or what you know now, when we should start to see the benefits of that.
Yeah, I think at the time of the investment, it was at least a couple of years out, and then for one reason or another, I think it slipped out, another year or so. But we'll follow up with that. And
okay, that'd be great.
Martine might also know that, but in the interest of not backtracking, we'll just gather up the information and include it in a written response.
Yeah, follow up is great. And then I'm just wondering, with respect to this, it sounds like there's some potentially wonderful opportunities through the affiliation with Michigan. I'm just and I know it's hard to quantify the administrative cost savings and the opportunities or the investments that you will not have to make in the future that you can build on theirs. I guess I'm just wondering, were there any estimates of the cost savings that other Blue Cross Blue Shield licensed companies realize from their partnerships with Michigan that might be a good indicator of what Vermont might see in the future?
So are you asking whether or not there's examples of cost savings that other Blue plans experienced in partnering with Michigan?
Yeah, if there was any data on that, just basically, you're not the first to partner with them. So I'm just wondering if there's any indicators from other partnerships, previous partnerships, of potential cost savings that they realized, or actual cost savings that they realized through the affiliation.
Yeah, and not submitted as part of this filing. There are longer term projections of what we would expect in terms of avoided costs or things that we're now able to do versus, or will then be able to do that we can't do today. Some of that work was grounded in some comparisons between I don't know if you're familiar with the Sherlock survey, which compares Blue plans to Blue plans and looks at where their per member per month administrative costs are relative to the survey participants. And so we were able to compare where our costs are compared to where the Michigan costs are. And so we have a pretty good idea where the efficiencies and where we won't have to invest in X as a developing a mobile app. We'll just be able to pay for that mobile app on a go-forward basis. So that's where our savings could come from. So I'll see if there's anything that I can find that would be responsive to your question. But it's we know
anything
they are partnering with other Blue plans, but they might be in different areas that are sort of unique to that partnership that's different than our proposed affiliation.
Yeah, and I mean, anything that you think that would be helpful for the board to understand what the potential cost savings might be and the timeline for those cost savings, recognizing I know you've testified and it's in the materials that there are no expected 2024 cost savings, but what those cost savings might be and when they might hit would be really helpful to understand.
Yeah. So, and I just need to, if I may, I'll just emphasize that one of the benefits of the affiliation has to do with cost effectively accessing programs that today we won't buy because we can't afford them. So it comes up from time to time in the integrated health care management area under Dr. Weigel, where there's this really cool program, but it's pretty costly to add that to our administrative costs, so we don't do it. So a lot of the value will come from being able to do things that we previously found it prohibitively expensive to venture into.
Great. Just building on that, and this is my last question actually, and I asked it of MVP the other day. But this is, this AI technology is coming out, and there are studies. There was, one by Sani and a bunch of other colleagues that estimate that adoption of what's already available in terms of AI technology could reduce total healthcare spending 5 to 10% in the next few years. Some of it coming from hospitals and physicians groups, but some of it coming actually from insurance companies. And estimates there are like saving 7 to 10% of total costs from better efficiencies in claims management and member services, better waste and fraud detection, efficiencies in admin, a whole list of areas where this AI could potentially really improve efficiencies. And I'm just wondering if Blue Cross Blue Shield is thinking about this, if they're exploring AI technology to reduce these kinds of costs, and if there's any projections, or have you even factored in any of these potential efficiencies in the coming year in your premiums for this year or plans for future years?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. The AI is a very good example of one of the things that a small health insurance plan struggles with, because, like you said, the potential for that technology, everyone's saying it's very, very high and has a lot of potential, but the cost to implement it, and I'll just add that in order to implement AI, sort of presumes that you have a strong data foundation, because the AI builds off of the data that you use in your business. And so you have to not only invest in the AI technology, but you have to invest in the data technology. And so that sort of opportunity up to this point really would be, for all practical purposes, beyond our grasp. I was involved, just anecdotally, I was involved in an internal review of an AI piece of technology for call center capabilities, and it was very, very expensive, and we deferred it because it just we don't have the data foundation that would connect into it. So I appreciate you bringing this up, as it's sort of like the robotics process automation of 2 or 3 or 5 years ago, RPA. As it gets adopted and used in the industry, we're able to get around to using some of that, but it does take an investment, and oftentimes it can be, at least in the early days especially, it can be quite expensive. And also, we have to be sure that it's going to work for our marketplace and our customers, because we like to think that we're, someone very wise told me that we wouldn't do AI for AI's sake. We'd have to make sure we're solving a business problem with it, and making sure we know which business problem that particular technology can solve is an important part of the planning step.
Great. All right. Well, those are my questions, and it'll be interesting to see where we are a year from now in terms of what's evolved with AI and what's affordable and what the opportunities are for administrative cost savings. So, well, thank you very much, Ruth. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Board Member Merman.
Hi. Thanks for taking a few more questions. Just to sort of piggyback on Jess Holmes's question regarding technologies and the affiliation with Michigan, when you prepare thoughts for us on ROI on various technological instruments, if you could think about them from the board's perspective, in the sense that, well, Blue Cross Blue Shield as a company may find significant return in an app if that leads to users more likely staying with Blue Cross Blue Shield. But if it leads to expenses where we're not having reduction in healthcare expenditures, from our standpoint, that's not necessarily a return. So just a slight difference in perspective that I would ask you to be mindful of for us to sort of understand where that's coming from. I have some more questions on the RBC. You said you can't publicly predict the future of RBC, but the last RBC that we have is from the end of December. And as you mentioned, last year's equity markets were down quite a bit, but this year's equity markets have been up quite a bit. Do you have a more recent RBC, say from the beginning of this month or the end of last month, that you could share with us?
Yeah, we can talk about that in executive session, where we typically don't report interim non-year-end RBC. Part of the reason for that is that there's calculations that go into a complete RBC calculation at the end of the year, including the premium deficiency reserve, the PDR that Mr. Becker mentioned earlier, as well as the pension valuation. But we do, in executive session, we do take the 434 at the end of 12/31/2022, and we look at our financial forecast, and then we do some statistical modeling around that financial forecast to give a sense of what we think the trajectory of RBC looks like. And I can certainly speak to, in executive session, where equity markets are and where year-to-date results are relative to the RBC. But we tend to focus on the projection of a year-end number, both at the end of 2023 and the end of 2024, with a range around that, because, as you know, equity markets change daily. So we are careful to not anchor on any one number through the year.
Yeah, I don't want to pretend to predict equity markets, but it was pretty far down in around December of 2022, and just a quick check of the S&P 500 so far since then, it's up 18%. So that could significantly change the amount that would be needed for reserves to reach your goal RBC. So that would be very helpful information to get in executive session, please. The other question that I have is on Exhibit 17 on the first page. I was wondering.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just have to get there real quick. You had testified earlier that the DFR said that if the rate was adjusted downward without actuarial supported, without something that was actually supported, it will, I think is the word you use, further erode your RBC. Could you read that sentence there? It's the second to last sentence on this page.
Ure. It says
it starts with the company's
RBC ratio. Yep.
Yep.
The company's RBC ratio is below its targeted range as of December 31st, 2022, and any downward adjustments to the filing's rate components that are not actuarially supported would likely further erode Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont surplus and RBC ratio.
Okay. I just want to clarify that I think the DFR used the term would likely as opposed to will, and since we're being very specific with our statistically related terminology, I thought that is important to point out. And the other question I have for you, and this question has a risk of being long-winded answer, and I think my colleagues would prefer it if we try not to. But I guess the question I have for you is, what is the role of a health insurance company in reducing costs or containing costs? What are the levers that you have to do that?
You mean overall cost of care?
Or overall cost of care and insurance companies in general, maybe not specifically Blue Cross Blue Shield.
Yeah, well, I guess I'd answer the role question in two ways. One is the role of the insurance company is to be the financer, if you will, for the community-rated participants who buy coverage from us. So that's what Martine was describing earlier today about our role is to provide for an estimate as to what the premiums will be required to cover all of the costs in 2024, and then we'll pay the providers. So we're the financer of that, if you will. The role of an insurance company in terms of reducing costs, this is such a multifaceted area of our work, in the sense that we support, and Dr. Weigel can speak to what I used to know as the triple aim, but I think they've added a few things to the triple aim. It's now maybe the quadruple aim, or even 5 aspects, but making sure that people have the right care in the right place at the right time and for the right cost. And so whether it's our prior authorizations or our payment integrity programs, which is another word for fraud, waste, and abuse programs, we are constantly coming at making sure that people are getting the care they need, but also working with providers to make sure that there isn't cost that shouldn't be in the system. But it is there's so many different aspects to that work. Some of it is the value-based reimbursement programs that I know Board Member Lunch will ask Dr. Weigel about. That the more we can try and encourage providers to look at the population health instead of the fee-for-service payments, that will be an aspect of cost, bending the cost curve. But the practicalities that all of those present in operating in the healthcare system is that oftentimes the insurer is held up as the barrier in creating paperwork for providers because of prior authorization requirements. But at the same time, we know that that is an area that we need to have in place in order to make sure that members are getting the right care and in the right venue. Similarly, if we push a provider in our payment integrity programs and we have an edit that says to a provider, we no longer pay for this claim in this circumstance because you have a different service that was paid, or whatever that edit is, we quite often get a lot of pushback from providers, and they will say, well, okay, I'll code it this way because I know that that'll get through the edit. So it's like a constant, when you think about our role, some of it is just looking at the whole landscape and understanding where things are working, where they're not working, and working with the healthcare system participants and stakeholders to see if we can improve the whole. I don't know if that gets at your question.
To some degree, there was an editorial written by one of the folks at Blue Cross Blue Shield about lower cost providers and trying to utilize lower cost providers. I guess my question too is getting at the concept of negotiation and how the influence of negotiating prices and having the role of the insurer in the negotiation role as opposed to an individual. And there are certain providers that seem to be lower cost. And is that a reflection of Blue Cross Blue Shield's ability to have stronger leverage in negotiating with them?
Well, there are certainly circumstances where we do have leverage, but we've talked with the board off and on over the years about the way Vermont provider geography and consolidation works. There's some important places where we don't have a lot of negotiation leverage. The fact of the matter is, if we I'll use the expression, if we go to the mat so to speak, with a hospital over a rate, we'll sort of end up in the situation where United and UVM Health Network were in, where suddenly there's members impacted by having to go out of network. And the irony is that in Vermont, with the network adequacy rules, we would still have to send many of our members to that hospital that we went to the mat with, and we'd end up paying more because we would be out of network at that point. So it is a very complicated environment in Vermont when it comes to exerting influence in the negotiation realm.
So I think implicit in that, would you agree that implicit in that is that there are certain providers that don't have the marketing, don't have the negotiation leverage with Blue Cross Blue Shield, and thus Blue Cross Blue Shield can negotiate lower rates with?
There are some providers, yeah. We also have a very well worn dialogue around in these rate hearings, in fact, around the providers viewing the approved budgets as sort of that's their budget. So there is no negotiation, and we've heard loudly and clearly from board members, Green Mountain Care Board members, that was intended to be a ceiling. It's not intended to be, you know, the rate. And what we've, I think in one of the binder documents we shared, the results of us sending out our negotiation letters last year after the budgets were approved, and I think there was all but one hospital did not move an inch. So, you know, this is something that is familiar territory to all of us.
Does Blue Cross Blue Shield track in any way? Let me back up. We hear a fair amount of public comment about concern of smaller providers going out of business because of reimbursements are so low. Does Blue Cross Blue Shield, are you aware of that public comment or those comments?
Yes, we are. Yeah.
And does Blue Cross Blue Shield sort of monitor the health of these smaller independent, and it appears on at least your cost tool, lower cost providers, their business health?
Yeah, this is probably an area that Dr. Weigel can speak more specifically to, but there are our provider contracting people and provider relations team are very close to all of the Vermont providers, and so there's a lot of discussions about what works or what doesn't work when it comes to helping providers stay in existence. We have an exciting program that I'm sure Dr. Weigel will talk more about, VBIC, our value-based care program that has been great for some providers, but it's a very small population of providers involved in that program. But we're always looking for programs. We in spite of not having a contract with One Care Vermont for 2023, we are continuing to pay the community providers that were attributed to One Care the payments as a transitionary measure. So we're very aware of the circumstances of the various different providers.
Great, and I'm looking forward to speaking more with Dr. Weigel. I guess the last question I have for you is, so if a lower cost provider was to go out of business in an area and patients were to seek care at the higher cost provider, how would that impact total cost?
Exactly as you imply. There is motivation to keep providers who can do quality work for the lowest cost, and if in fact a provider does go out of business and the members have to go elsewhere for a higher cost, our premiums will feel the impact of that.
Okay. Well, thanks, and thanks for all your time today.
Thank you.
Chair Foster?
Yeah, thank you. I have a few questions, Ms. Green. Jumping off of Dr. Merman's questions, when you're allocating this rate increase across your provider network, do you consider the cost of the facilities in making those determinations?
Yeah, I feel like I need to clarify that we don't allocate the increase across the providers or across any of the pieces in the way that I'm understanding your question. What we do is look at the various contracting circumstances of the provider network, and as Martine indicated, we work with our provider contracting folks to understand what the future rate changes will look like, and then we build that up into what we think the premiums will be required for 2024, and then calculate the increase. So if in the end, when we get to 2024, if provider increases are different than what we assumed in the rate filing, that is, that just falls out of all of the assumptions that we said earlier are just bad assumptions. But I feel like I'm not getting at the core of your question about choices we might be making in the context of what I've just shared. Can I ask if you could clarify a little bit more what you're asking?
Yeah, I think you started touching on it, but when you're coming up with the rate, you're anticipating provider increases across your network. And so that has hospitals, it has independents, it has behavioral health, has all kinds of providers in it. And right. in trying to estimate those provider increases across the provider type, do you consider, what do you consider? And I think if I can fast forward, my understanding is for hospitals that GMCB regulates, you take whatever the number is that you think the Green Mountain Care, whatever they requested, and then perhaps a discount off of that based on historical Green Mountain Care Board cuts. And what I'm trying to understand is, what do you do for everyone else?
Right, so that helps a lot, thank you. So the way, when the hospitals go through the budget process and they get their budgets approved, it's actually after that process that then they come back and say, okay, well, that we got approved XYZ commercial rate increases, so this is what we propose. And then, as I said, we push back, but very seldom do they move off of that. But the hospitals are made up of, the inpatient, the outpatient, and their provider practices, and they will work with our provider reimbursement folks to get all of the rates for their services sort of in a mix that supports an overall commercial rate increase of, say, 12%, just to pick a number. So that process, when we're looking at what the community providers' increases should be, it's our own provider contracting folks who are looking at, which services are maybe outliers, or maybe a Medicare reimbursement level has moved and we need to keep pace with that. So we will look at where the most the highest priority of where all those pain points are, and then we will allocate within an overall budget of, sometimes it's 3%, sometimes it's 5%, but it's separate from the hospitals. We find that if we were to try and reduce the practice rates at a hospital, that doesn't really fund anything in the community provider world for us, because they will expect to have that made up elsewhere in the hospital budget. So the hospital budgets are very hard to move in total. I don't know if that again, trying to be responsive to your question.
I think that was helpful. So it sounds like there's two different sort of frameworks within which you negotiate. One is the Green Mountain Care Board rates with the hospitals, and then the other is doing a review of, like you said, if there's outliers or if there's Medicare reimbursement changes or particular financial need at non-hospitals. But those sound like two sort of distinct sort of processes. Is that fair?
Yeah, as would be durable medical equipment. You know, we're working all of the providers in that space. Or I was trying to think of some other examples of provider services that are outside the hospital realm.
Right. So in terms of trying to go to affordability or making it more affordable, I guess I should say, do you think it would be better if there were, if rates were allocated more towards lower cost facilities?
Do you mean within the rates or within the hospital budgets? I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that question.
When Blue Cross is deciding, and I understand the market dynamics and the negotiation leverage, I get all that. But from a theoretical perspective or a policy perspective, if we're trying to drive down costs and keep it affordable, do you think it would be more advantageous to be able to allocate the rate increases that the Care Board provides to Blue Cross if it were in consideration of lower cost options, i.e. provide more financial support or higher rate increases to more cost-effective facilities?
That's an interesting concept. We do have programs and analysis that we do on a regular basis that looks at where the sort of high value, I'll call it high value providers are, because it'll be, you know, high quality for a lower cost and so on. But the idea of I'm putting words into your mouth, but some sort of variable rate change that's driven by you know, where care is directed. Interesting concept, but as I sit here, I'm struggling to see how it would fit in today's filing process, but certainly willing to talk about it.
I'll ask you a few follow-up questions on affordability. I thought Ms. Lemieux's testimony was very helpful in understanding Blue Cross's process. And I'll preface these questions by saying I acknowledge that a lot of the, if people consider it unaffordable, and a lot of people do, it's because of the inputs, and I get that. In terms of when Blue Cross prepares its rate to submit to the board, is there any evaluation of affordability in determining what the rate should be that you request?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to participate in the conversation about affordability, and in my direct testimony, I indicated that the non-actuarial criteria of affordability, access, and quality are all important, but they are in some ways in tension with one another, in the sense that the more you increase access and quality and add benefits, which is what we call access, or is a form of access, then the price will go up. So in the process of submitting rates, and this is, I think, consistent with what Martine was indicating earlier this morning, is that the process of submitting rates is all about making sure that the premiums are funded for 2024, given the regulatory framework and the products that are being offered. So when we think about affordability at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont, we're thinking of it more in the broader sense of what are the policies and regulatory framework that brings these policies to Vermonters. But when we're developing the rate, we have to make sure, from a solvency point of view, that the rate is adequate. So I'm drawing a distinction between thinking about affordability as we develop a rate versus thinking about affordability as we support our members in many ways to access the programs and policies that are there, because that's in tension with access and quality. So you can't have high affordability, high quality, and high access all the time. There's no equation that gets you all of that. So given the access and the quality that we're being asked to supply through the ACA market for individual and small groups, the rate development process is determining what are the premium rates that are required. So again, I hope I haven't confused, but it's, we don't think about affordability in the rate development process per se, but we're always thinking about affordability in the grand scheme of products that can be offered to Vermonters. A good example is the Medicare Advantage segment that we worked hard to enter, that our Medicare supplement products are very good quality, great products. A lot of people buy them, but they are quite expensive. So the Medicare Advantage option is a lower cost option, has a different way of going to market, but nonetheless will meet the needs of many Vermonters. So it was important for us to have those choices and those options out there for our Vermont seniors. So part of our thinking around affordability has to do with making sure that our system in total is delivering options that people can find a solution that fits them. And the ACA is designed for assuming, especially in particular in the individual market, that it's designed assuming that there will be subsidies. So that's such an important part of understanding how to think about affordability. So if we just reduce premium rates to save in the name of affordability, all of the subsidized members, all that will do is reduce the amount of federal subsidies that come through. It does not actually change the cost of care or anything like that. So it's important to think about affordability in the context of the regulatory framework.
So I appreciate all of that, and I think that's all fair, and I'm glad you shared that. My question's very specific, though, and I just want to understand this answer. Did Blue Cross and Blue Shield make any adjustment in their rate due to people's ability to pay for this premium?
We did not, and it's because the subsidies takes care of that. So to the extent that the regulatory framework is designed for the lower and modest income people to pay very, very little monthly premium for what is by many standards a very high quality coverage. So the income aspect is wrapped up in how the subsidies work.
And this might be a broader conversation that's not particularly keyed in on this, but I want to share a reflection that I had, if you don't mind, which is affordability is a component of this process, and we have to evaluate it and consider it. And I do think it's important that these plans be affordable. I think that matters. But Blue Cross doesn't really have many levers to go to other than some of the things you were speaking about. We can make sure people know about the subsidies. We can drive and direct people to the right product for their needs. We can lower our admin costs. And it seems to me like Blue Cross is doing a pretty effective job at those and putting in a pretty good effort on those, which is great and should be commended. But then you have the inputs, which are hospital costs, pharma costs, non-hospital costs. And if those aren't reviewed in light of affordability, it sounds like your testimony is there's not much opportunity for Blue Cross, which strikes me as potentially have some level of truth to it. Is that fair?
I think that is fair, and I think you're describing it as inputs. 90% of the premium goes directly to all of those inputs and those costs. So anytime we can participate in whatever efforts might be out there to just make healthcare less expensive. I mean, healthcare is very expensive, and until we can figure out a way to help, I'll just throw out a random example, but if we could collectively in Vermont find a way to help the hospitals not have to rely so heavily on all these travel resources, I speculate that that's a source of but the hospitals are much more well positioned to tackle some of those questions because, like Martine said, I'm not an expert in hospital accounting or budgets. I look at their submissions to the board from time to time to try and understand more about what's there, but anything that we can do that would add value in that process, we're
Right.
more than willing to.
So if we were to reduce Blue Cross's rate, but the inputs didn't change and there were no meaningful avenues on the admin side or efficiency side at Blue Cross, that's when we get into the solvency issue.
Correct.
Right. I'm just being mindful of time. I want to summarize what I thought some of the other board members, I think as Member Holmes and Merman, were going to. On the CTR things, I think the concern, and we don't know this to be the case, but the concern sounds like that there's all these other things that can impact CTR and your RBC. And we don't want small and individual QHP plan members to be paying to make up for problems that are causing RBC to go down that aren't attributed to those plans, right? So if there's investment losses or there's other products that you're offering that are dragging down RBC, we don't want to see that made up for over here, right? So I know this was asked for, I think, by the other members, but information showing us the impact downward that these plans have had on RBC vis-a-vis the others would be relevant, right? We just want to be careful that these aren't disproportionately making up for losses in the pension that were due to something else or disproportionately. And I'm sure you can understand that. So information on that would be great.
Yeah, and if I may, just a slight reframing of that is that if our insured books of business were consistently realizing fully funded premiums, then all the other things that are affecting RBC will have to be risk managed as well. So the way I think about it is that the appropriately funded premiums and a contribution to maintain reserves, if we're consistently doing that, as DFR's opinion says so well, then that's the core solvency driver. And then the other market changes, I mentioned that equities are invested in because over the long haul they will help us grow surplus. In 1 year it's a detriment, but that will not, in a world where premiums are fully funded, the equity market volatility in RBC is something that we would certainly manage through in any given year. So as I said in my direct testimony, this market segment has not produced a minimum level of CTR in recent years, and it really, in Exhibit 1, I forget which page it's on, but it's the CTR on, I've got it highlighted here, page 6 on Exhibit 1 shows that for the 9 years, 1, 2, 3, the 9 years listed there, it's lost 0.7 or $9 million. So for 9 years, we've foregone any contribution to reserves on average, and so that is a fundamental gap in maintaining RBC, no matter what else is happening to RBC.
Right. And the other ways I was jotting some down where RBC could be improved without coming from rate increases would be directing care, ensuring care is being provided at the most cost-effective locations, avoiding market losses to the extent possible, reducing expenses, which I know here sounds like it's not as much of a available bucket, and ensuring non-duplication of tests and procedures, things like that, which I'm sure are all on your radar. But my point is just that rate is not the only way to improve RBC, and I know you're aware of that, but we want to make sure that we don't harm rates as to the extent we can, keep them affordable. It's great. Let me just check my notes real quick. Oh, two other questions. On the, what I'll call pay parity, can you give us a general sense of whether or not hospitals in Vermont receive a larger rate increase than the other hospitals you contract with in New Hampshire and New York?
I would ask Dr. Weigel to confirm this, that I think historically, at least in the exhibits that we've produced here for this rate filing and in previous rate filings, that our success rate at negotiating a lower trend over time with the New Hampshire hospital is lower than what we've seen in the Vermont. I don't know which New York hospitals, if any, we directly contract with.
Okay.
But that is something that either Dr. Weigel can answer, or if he can't answer, we can follow up separately.
And then relatedly, are the rate increases that the Vermont hospitals receive generally larger than the non-hospital medical providers Blue Cross contracts with within Vermont?